So thanks once again for joining. I'll introduce myself in the context of introducing the project overall and what it's done, but I want to acknowledge you all and acknowledge some of the members of the working group that's helped to move this along that are on the call here today as well. So the purpose of this call is just to take you through so the current thinking around what a stewardship scheme for electronic waste could look like for New Zealand. We'll take you through the current context and the nature of the project. Then we'll take you through what that scheme could look like. That'll take roughly another 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll just briefly cover what the next steps are and go into some Q&A with you as well. So this process started last year when the Minister for the Environment declared electronic waste a priority product under the Waste Minimisation Act. There were a few other products that had that same declaration as well around that time. And so what that's done is triggered a process of designing what a product stewardship scheme for electronic waste might look like. And so TechCollect NZ and a working group called the Circular E-Stewards Network, which is made up of around 17 different stakeholders representing a pretty broad range of interests and stakeholder groups, has been working on to develop what a scheme could look like. At the end of September, we'll put a report to the Ministry for the Environment on going through some of those options and providing some recommendations around the scheme. My name is Simon Nafika. I work at EY in the Climate Change and Sustainability team there, and our role in this process is just supporting TechCollect and the working group as co-chair of the working group and supporting this process of stakeholder engagement, helping out with some of the research activities that have helped to feed into the working group. And so along that kind of project plan, we've been engaging with stakeholders through a range of different methods, and we're up to the stage of we've formed some ideas and we're keen to share those with a broader network of stakeholders and keen to get your feedback. And then that feedback will get assessed and put into, incorporated into the report that goes to the ministry. We've also had a range of research activities go on to look at the current state of the e-waste collection network in New Zealand, looking at what other schemes have been doing overseas, picking up on some of the international research around e-waste that helps inform the discussion and the work of the working group. Just one bit of housekeeping around what we mean when we talk about e-waste. Last year when the Minister made their declaration, they referred to this broad set of types of products that make up our electronics sector and that become waste, electrical equipment and electronics at the other end. The only kind of proviso on this is there was a separate process that the ministry ran, got going around large-scale batteries, so category 7. Your kind of electric vehicle batteries and that kind of scale was run by the battery industry group. Small-scale batteries are part of our scope for this project here. And I mentioned at the start that working group that was set up representing a pretty broad range of stakeholders and a diversity of interests and activities represented across that working group, but it was pretty strong alignment in terms of the eventual, the outcome that we're trying to achieve that a product stewardship scheme could help to bring about around achieving a more circular economy, around moving things up the waste hierarchy, and around looking at opportunities, for our communities and for our economy in the process. And this diagram was just a collaborative effort among a number of working group members around, there's a range of different items in terms of those, that broad range of product categories. And there's a few key threads of activities that can happen to achieve that long-term aspiration, getting more recovery and recycling going so that e-waste doesn't have to get disposed into the landfill, getting more repair and reuse going so that items can, have a second and third life in the economy before needing to get recycled, and then looking at what we could do up at, that kind of product design and manufacturing space to move things, up to that higher end of the waste hierarchy where you're reducing the amount of waste that gets generated from the outset. And so when we map that kind of thinking around, this the ecosystem or the value chain for electronic products and e-waste, in terms of what that long-term aspiration means and sort of how to get there, it's about ensuring there's that sense of shared responsibility, that we all have a part to play, and we're all doing our bit to move us in the right direction, that we're prioritizing the waste hierarchy, so moving things up from what might be getting disposed of now to um, making them more easily recycled, and then moving up the waste hierarchy still further, ensuring that the producers of our electronic products are playing a role in this as well, and there's a couple of ways that they could do that, and then that general sense around acknowledging how important our natural environment and the health of our natural environment is for New Zealanders, and for making sure that those connections to our environment stay strong, and then looking at what sort of opportunities this could have for our community, and for our environment, for our economy as well. So within that kind of like broad and kind of long-term aspiration to achieve a circular economy, we've broken it down into different areas of that sort of value chain or life cycle that a stewardship scheme could help to address. And these are, it's really, it comes down to there's a strong kind of agreement around that long-term aspiration, and the options around how you could design a product stewardship scheme is about what is the appropriate pathway to get there, and what are the different options you could go with to move us in that direction. And that's where this work and our report up to the ministry in a couple of months' time will feed into. And so we've broken down that life cycle around to those three threads: recovery and recycling, repair and reuse, and product design. And what we're presenting for the next sort of 40 minutes or so is how that might look like if you combined, if you had things in place in the stewardship scheme that incorporated each of those three. And we're keen to get feedback on what your thinking is in terms of which of these aspects might be the most appropriate one to make the focus of the stewardship scheme and the activities. So there's an acknowledgement there that there's a pretty strong alignment around that long-term aspiration, and an acknowledgement that there's compared to where we are now, there's quite a long road to get there, and the product stewardship scheme being one of the ways that we can forge a pathway to that outcome, and there being different ways that you could go about addressing that. But there was also acknowledgement there around the current state for electronic products, as well as most other products at the moment, still follows that predominantly linear model of sort of make, use, and dispose. And with electronic products, there are some areas where there's some good, there's some activity happening, whether it be around repair and reuse of appliances, whether it be around certain categories within certain types of product within that broad definition of e-waste, where there is good recovery, collection, and recycling going already, and there's already a market for some of those. And the working group's really mindful of that, and looking at how could that what we currently have be enhanced and further supported. How could some of the gaps be filled? How could some of the improvements that are required be made? And so in terms of the different ways that you could orient a product stewardship scheme for e-waste and what it might look like mechanically, I'll pass it on to my colleague shortly to take you through some of those kind of design considerations for some of the key elements of what a product stewardship scheme for e-waste could look like. And this kind of summarizes that sense of if you were to include all three of those threads, recovery and recycling, repair and reuse, and product design into the scheme, what would be the appropriate staging of those kind of sets of requirements so that you're achieving that move up the waste hierarchy, so that you're starting to bring that more circular approach to goods moving through the economy, and then being recovered and recirculated. And then also, in terms of what the priorities are in the short, medium, and long term. So you'll see this kind of staging approach come through in the slides that we show you today. And we're really keen to get people's feedback. The working group's keen to test its thinking around, is it appropriate to look at all three of these in the context of a product stewardship scheme? Um, what sort of activities or kind of priorities should be the focus within those? And in terms of this sort of staging approach, what sort of time frame? You'll see that, short term, medium, long term, they don't have numbers attached to them. So we're keen to get people's feedback on, what time frame do you think is appropriate to achieve some of the priority objectives that the working group's been considering for each of those time frames. And so you'll see, the way that this is laid out, this is, just one of the ways that the product stewardship scheme could roll out, is where the initial sort of short-term focus would be on the recovery and recycling aspects, and really getting the network and the capability and the capacity up to the point where e-waste no longer needs to go in the landfill. That being the short term, the primary focus in the short term, and then setting things up as a secondary kind of, things happening sort of in the background, and things being discussed and agreed on to be made part of the scheme and implemented over the medium and long term. So there's that sort of staging approach where you might be doing some research or having some conversations to then agree on what things can be implemented at a later date. So I'll pass it on to my colleague Isaac now, and he'll take you through some of the mechanics or some of the different elements that the working group's been considering.
Thanks, Simon. Kia ora koutou. Thanks for being with us here today. It's great to be able to share what's been going on behind the scenes for the past year or so. Before I start on the governance structure, just to add an extra point to the pathway to circularity aspects, what we've presented today is one of a number of options that were initially considered by the working group at different ways of staging these different short, medium, and long term primary and secondary focuses. It came down to wanting to present a complete design consideration around this, and testing the idea, and then going back to the drawing board with feedback to see how this might change over time. So there has been some consideration around the different ways that this could be laid out prior to presenting it to you today. Looking at the governance structure, what we're presenting on today is really just sort of the structure and the makeup of the governance aspect of the scheme. Once we've had some feedback from stakeholders through this webinar process, we'd look to develop the processes behind each of the different components in the structure and deliver that as part of the final recommendations report in September. The governance structure can really be thought of as three core components. The first is the advisory groups. Now, these are made up of the various stakeholders within the e-product and e-waste management area, and are really designed to provide advice on the different requirements which are being set by the independent board. The number of advisory groups pictured here is 4, but the reality is that this would be changed depending on what is deemed appropriate to get enough feedback from different stakeholders. The second aspect, or the second component, is the independent board. Now, their role really is to set the requirements for the scheme manager in line with the agreement that scheme manager has and the Product Stewardship Organisation as a whole has with the Ministry for the Environment and the Minister for the Environment to get the accreditation to run the scheme. Really looking to have this board with members that are impartial, independent, have some board and governance expertise, as well as an understanding of both the regulatory framework which the scheme operates under, as well as the practicalities of e-waste management. The third major component is the scheme manager, which is really the day-to-day operator of the scheme and ensuring it's administered in line with the agreement and the accreditation requirements. The product stewardship organisation and the scheme manager would be a not-for-profit entity due to some guidelines that from the Ministry for the Environment around regulated product stewardship schemes and the way in which they should be governed. Aside from ensuring that it's meeting and adhering to the accreditation that it's been provided by the Minister for the Environment, the scheme manager would also seek to operate the scheme to meet those those outcomes that Simon mentioned earlier around promoting shared responsibility for managing e-waste, prioritising the waste hierarchy, ensuring producers are putting the effort into improving the design of their products, respecting the natural environment, and driving economic benefits for New Zealand. The process of choosing the scheme manager and accrediting them to run the scheme really comes down to the Minister for the Environment, and then the Ministry for the Environment then acts as the government regulator, overseeing that scheme manager and ensuring that the accreditation and the agreement is being met by that scheme manager. This process will be described a bit more once we get to the next steps at the end of the presentation. Let's go to the next slide. The next area of design consideration is targets and data collection. Now, targets already set the direction for the scheme and influence a lot of the other design considerations that are coming up, such as fees and monitoring and compliance. Behind these targets is data, which is really seen as vital to setting targets that are both achievable by the scheme and for monitoring performance against those targets over time. The collection of data would come, the responsibility of that would come down to the scheme manager, and they'd be collecting data from the service providers, so recyclers, collectors, transporters, anybody that's operating under the scheme. With any system that's collecting that data, there'd be principles in there around collecting commercially sensitive information, just ensuring that those companies or those organisations providing data can be sure that there's no way in which that data can be linked back to them. In the short term, there's one target and two sets of data collection. The first is a material recovery target, and that relates to the proportion of an electronic product that's being sent to be recycled into new usable materials after the product's been broken down into its constituent parts. This has been looked at for the short term due to international research on weight-based targets, which showed that in the short term, without proper data on the scheme's operation, it can really work to the detriment of the scheme by either limiting the amount that is collected, or potentially overextending the scheme and the recycling capacity of the local market in which that scheme is operating in. The material recovery target in the short term enables as much e-waste to be collected as possible within the confines of the recycling capacity that's available to it, while also ensuring that there's good recycling outcomes for those products that are collected. The material recovery target would be based on onshore and offshore recycling capacity, noting that many categories of e-waste currently can't be recycled onshore in New Zealand. This target would be scaled and increased through regular review by the scheme manager and ensure that capacity for recycling is aligned with those different product categories and is achievable. In the short term, also looking to collect data to help support the target set in the medium term. So looking at data collection around repair and reuse services available for each category, looking at the quantity and types of e-waste collected by the scheme that are able to be repaired or reused, and the weight-based, to support the weight-based target, looking at data around how much e-waste is being collected for each category. In the medium term, there'd be three targets being implemented. The first being that weight-based target for each category of e-waste. The next would be a percentage total of all the total products collected by the scheme that are either able to be repaired or reused, and a reasonable access target for e-waste collection sites, which has been a point raised by the working group due to the importance of collection sites in enabling a scheme to operate successfully and allowing consumers to access those sites with their products. In the long term, there's no additional targets at this stage being proposed or being considered, but there would be some data collection around the number of low-fee products under the proposed eco-modulation fee, which we'll get onto shortly. These targets, there could be targets implemented around this in the future, but at this stage, it's just too far out to really make a proper suggestion on that. We're really interested in getting feedback on the way that these targets have been laid out and what targets have been suggested. We'd also love to hear if there are any alternatives, better ways that the scheme could be set up to ensure, positive outcomes from what's happening, and specifically around weight-based targets, and whether there are better alternatives to these. Moving on to the fee structure, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the fee structure really underpins how the scheme will fund itself and fund the activities occurring under it. Before I explain the three fee types being considered, I just got to run you through when a fee is required to be paid and who the liable party is. So selling a product under the Waste Minimisation Act, a priority product under the Waste Minimisation Act triggers the requirement to act in accordance with an accredited scheme for that priority product. A sale is defined as offering any priority product for sale, or distributing or delivering that priority product, regardless of whether an exchange of value occurs. So if a liable party was to sell a television, for example, and they offered a free Blu-ray player with that television, that would still be covered by the scheme, as it was to be considered distributing that priority product. After the sales triggered, this is when the regulations, which have yet to be created and would be developed to support the final scheme design, that's when these would come in. And these regulations really explain who the liable party is, how much the fee would be, or the process for determining what the fee would be, and when this would be required to be paid. At this stage, we're envisioning that a liable party would be anyone that basically puts that product up for sale, whether that be producers, importers, distributors, installers, whoever's the first one to basically put that product up for sale. The use of the fee is tightly prescribed by the Waste Minimisation Act, and it's really only to be used for end-of-life management activities and some core administration scheme functions, which we'll get onto shortly. Those providing services to the scheme, so those providing recycling, collection, and transportation activities, would be eligible for payment under the scheme for those services. So it really is a case of the liable party paying the fee to the scheme manager, and the scheme manager then distributing the cost of distributing that fee to those providing services, end-of-life management services. The proposed design is still being considered, and that's why we've got three fees being presented to you today. I'll just run you through what these fees are, and then we've got a list of sort of pros and cons around each to give you a bit of an idea and help you with providing any feedback on this. So the first one is a volume-based fee, and that's basically where liable parties will pay a portion of the total end-of-life processing cost for each e-product category that's been collected through the scheme, and that portion is based on their market share for that category of e-product. An advanced fee, on the other hand, is implemented at the beginning. It's placed on liable parties as an advanced disposal fee, and is based on the quantity of products imported into New Zealand based on the New Zealand customs import data. So it's paid upfront when the product's imported. Finally, eco-modulation is another type of advanced fee where the fees are modulated for the liable parties depending on their adherence to a set of criteria that are ultimately designed to influence product design standards. And some examples of this, which in no way have been set as the final options or are even potentially a short list, but could be stuff like use of recycled materials in products, the minimization of chemical or hazardous material use, energy efficiency of products, the percentage of the product which can be recycled at the end of its life, ease of repairability, and ease of availability of repair services. We just go through the next slide. So just looking at these different fee structures across their pros and cons, for the volume-based fee, because it's set at the end of the end-of-life management stage of a product's life cycle, it's a lot better at reflecting the true cost of recycling for that product, because it's charged as it happens. As a result, those longer life products, such as solar panels that have limited recycling options at present, can be more accurately reflected in the cost, and the cost of those can be more accurately passed on to liable parties. It's also, because it's related to the cost of recycling at the time, it's better able to reflect the changing market the market prices for the different components that make up e-products. On the other hand, because it's charged at the end of life, relating that cost back to the consumer at the beginning of the life cycle, or where it's produced, is a little bit more difficult, in the sense that the price can't be put straight, it can't be linked straight back to the consumer. And it would need to be sort of estimated based on what's being charged at the end of life. Advance fees, on the other hand, provide a better upfront visibility of the fees, because they're charged, as the product's imported and put up for sale. And so consumers can have better visibility of what's going on if that's what's desired. On the other hand, because they're set up front, they have to estimate how much it's going to cost for that product to be managed at the end of its life. And for longer life products, this is where it becomes really difficult, because a longer life product like a fridge or a freezer, which 10 to 15 years in the future the cost of recycling that may be significantly different to what it is today, and predicting that is highly difficult, especially when you bring in the idea of a fluctuating market for those different materials. Both of these fee types also struggle to provide any targeted incentives for addressing product design and the negative aspects of product design, which is why we've also included eco-modulation as a potential fee structure to be considered. Let me just go through the next slide, Simon. So eco-modulation is really about, it is there because it can promote effective product stewardship interventions at the top of the waste hierarchy by using that fee as an incentive for better product design. The drawbacks to this, however, though, is it is a relatively new approach, with only 1 or 2 jurisdictions currently looking to implement it across the world, and it is difficult to apply across as a blanket modulation criteria across all e-product categories, noting that many are in different stages of their journey towards a circular resource use, or their ability to be repaired, recycled, etc. It's sort of a follow-on for this. It really does require significant consultation with the stakeholders that are involved with those different e-product categories, and consideration of the international market situation when setting that criteria, noting that New Zealand really doesn't have a huge amount of say with producers over how products are designed, and when you compare it to the likes of the EU and the US markets. And so we want to make sure that if eco-modulation was used, the criteria wouldn't be going above and beyond what these bigger markets are doing, because it could reduce the availability of products in New Zealand. Finally, it really does have the potential to limit the implementation of the scheme if this modulation criteria is brought in the beginning. And so what you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation is it's kind of we sort of imagine that this would come in the longer term time periods. We are really interested in feedback on all of these different fee types, and what you think of them, whether you think they're appropriate, and how exactly they could be structured to support the scheme, and potentially even other fee structures which aren't being presented today. The next design consideration looks at mandatory standards. So standards are really trying to strike the right balance in the scheme between positive environmental, social outcomes from those activities occurring under the scheme, but not trying to place too many limits or too many burdens on potential service providers, and thereby reducing the number available for activities under the scheme. We know that there are already several standards in place for some service providers, which would already adequately provide for those positive environmental, social outcomes. For example, transporters transporting dangerous goods are already required to operate in the confines of the Land Transport Rule on dangerous goods. So adding more in here probably isn't necessary. For those that are required to meet mandatory standards, there'd be a lead-in period of at least 12 months to allow service providers to meet the standards. That is with the exception of those mandatory standards which are already in place. For example, repairers and resellers are already required to conform to standards around safety of second-hand products, for example, the test and tag regulation. We are looking for feedback on this area, especially around the lead-in period, and what stakeholders believe is acceptable, or what's reasonable to allow enough time for service providers to meet the proposed standards. Any certification against mandatory standards would be done by a third party, with evidence needing to be provided to the scheme manager to show that certification had been met. In the short term, mandatory standards would be looking to cover e-waste recyclers, and the current standards being considered are a range of options, including closer to home standards such as ASNZS 5377, and moving further abroad to the likes of E-Stewards from the US and CEN, which is a European standard. In the short term, we'd also look to do some research. The scheme manager would also look to do some research on e-waste collection sites and to understand the alignment and the current state of those collection sites and what kind of support they may need to reach to upgrade the sites to meet standards in the medium term. This is really just based on, again, that notion that collection sites are extremely important for the success of the scheme. However, they're usually run by not-for-profits, volunteer organisations, and potentially council-run, and may lack the resources to really improve the site over time. The support isn't necessarily financial support, but it would be designed to ensure that how mandatory standards and how they're applied in the medium term is workable. Again, so medium term, moving towards mandatory standards for repairers and e-waste collectors, and the standards being considered are those considered in the short term, as you can see on the screen. If the eco-modulation criteria was carried forward and implemented in the long term, the medium term would see some research around production standards and to see how potentially these could be incorporated into that fee modulation criteria. And we'll just head through to the compliance and monitoring. So the compliance and monitoring aspect is really just there to ensure that the requirements being set by the scheme are being met and aligned to by those that are needing to align to them, and also to give an idea of what's actually happening out there in the industry. In the short term, the key activity would be the development of a tracking system for all e-products in New Zealand. This would really allow for the scheme to see how many products are in New Zealand and estimate where they are approximately in their life cycle. This would take a while to provide a full picture of what's going on, noting that legacy products wouldn't be incorporated into this. However, the aim is ultimately to enable the scheme to better predict how many products might be expected for repair, reuse and recycling, and ensure that capacity is available for these services when they're needed. So really just trying to be proactive with how the scheme's planning out the network. Additional activities in the short term would be the exploration of product labelling as either a compliance aspect or a fee modulation criteria. There's been some debate in the working group around whether labelling would be a good idea or whether it's more or less just an extra burden that the scheme might impose. However, there are aspects of labelling that have been suggested that could be a positive outcome, especially for consumers, such as promoting expected product life, showing a product design score, or just simply indicating that there's end-of-life management services available for the product and that the product should not be placed in landfill. This is a core area that we're seeking feedback on from stakeholders, just due to the debate amongst the working group on this. Also in the short term, looking to engage with auditing services, third-party auditing services, to understand and ensure that in the medium and long term, there are auditing services available for those that have mandatory standards requirements. This mandatory auditing would initially begin for recyclers in the medium term. The audit frequency is still up for debate, but one suggestion from the working group was that it be based on risk. So a higher risk operation that has a higher risk of environmental and social harm sees a higher frequency of auditing requirements to make sure that the standards are being adhered to, and vice versa. So, for example, a recycler where there's more breakdown of products into their constituent parts and potentially greater risk of environmental damage from that, maybe seeing a higher frequency of auditing perhaps annually versus a collector where it's just a collection site, and so maybe that's more of a biannual activity. There'll be also additional engagement in the medium term with auditing service to see if product auditing would be a plausible option in the long term as a way to support the eco-modulation criteria if that was implemented. And this is just really to ensure that those products that are meeting low fee requirements or criteria are actually, meeting. There's no fraud going on with that kind of system. And in the medium term as well, that mandatory auditing coming in for e-waste collectors and e-product repairers. This is another area, again, feedback is welcomed, just to make sure that this is a balanced approach to ensure that there are good outcomes without causing too much of a headache for those service providers. We've just got 2 more slides, another 5 or so minutes, and then we'll get on to Q&A and the next steps. Just looking at design considerations around regulation. So the regulation's really just some levers within the Waste Minimisation Act itself that are designed to support the scheme to carry out its role. The regulation will be phased in over the different time periods to support the different rollout of different aspects under the scheme. Additional legislation is likely required to support different aspects of the scheme, such as reuse and repair. For example, with the Consumer Guarantees Act, there's been note that may need to be amended to better support repair and reuse activities, particularly around the ability to opt out of providing spare parts or repair for products if it's made known up front. In the short term, the regulation would just really be focused around laying the foundations to support the scheme's function, so the collection of fees and the implementation of standards and collecting info. The medium term, the real core regulation here would be the prohibition of disposal for e-waste, so a landfill ban. And that's just really noting that in the short term, the main aim is to set up that ability for all products covered under the scheme to have a recycling option, and therefore by the medium term not needing to be placed into landfill anymore. Also included in the medium term is implementation of standards on repairers, noting that that's something that comes in the medium term. Finally, if the labelling feedback on labelling and the investigations into whether this is possible come back as positive, look to implement this over the medium term. Finally, to support any eco-modulation criteria that comes in, there is the potential to use the control or prohibition of certain materials or products for sale in New Zealand. However, it's not an absolute necessity. It could just be used if it's deemed necessary. And finally, design considerations around the scheme manager roles and responsibilities. This is really just laying out the possible requirements for a future operator of the scheme. Now, these responsibilities would form part of that administration cost that gets siphoned off the fee paid by liable parties, as mentioned earlier. However, again, potentially limited by the Waste Minimisation Act and its just definition of what the fee collected for a product stewardship scheme can actually be used for. There is a potential that some of these proposed roles and responsibilities may not fall under that definition. Foundational roles include the collection and distribution of fees, data collection, scheme monitoring, and the maintenance of the scheme. There's also some additional roles in these scheme manager roles and responsibilities that are based on some research that Tech Collect NZ has done, and that's just around the repair network, which was noted as being in a significantly less developed state when compared to recovery and recycling, and the notion that it potentially needs some more support, more targeted support to really get it up to the standard of a coverage for all New Zealanders that want to get their products repaired once the scheme's established. The schemes would always be seeking to improve, strengthening, enhancing the network, but also looking a bit more future focused and looking at things like promoting sharing economy initiatives to really start to challenge those traditional ownership models, moving away from everybody owning their individual items to more around how can products be shared, how can products be leased, to thereby reduce the amount of products being created in the first place. This is a long-term initiative, though, and really is something that would be needing to be looked at once the core scheme has been established. We're really interested in your feedback on these roles and responsibilities, checking whether or not they're appropriate, whether we've got too much here, maybe there aren't enough to really ensure that the scheme managers are acting on all aspects of the e-waste and e-product life cycle. Finally, there's just there are a set of stakeholder roles and responsibilities that have been developed for the stakeholder engagement, but just due to there being a number of them, they're a little bit clunky and difficult to present on a slideshow. So what we've done is there will be attached to the pack that's sent out to you after this webinar, and they're also available in the feedback survey for you to have a review and a chance to have feedback on those. I'll just pass back to Simon now, and he'll go through the next steps, and we'll have some Q&A.
Thanks, Isaac. So I just had to take myself off mute there. And thanks everyone for listening. We've just got a couple more minutes and then we can have some Q&A as well. So just to take you through, firstly, where we're at in the process and what happens after today, and then also what happens after the report from this process goes up to the ministry at the end of September. So we're at the stage in this process where we've got some options around ways that this product stewardship scheme could be set up, and we're keen to get broader feedback from yourselves and from a wide range of stakeholders. We'll feed that back into the working group to assess and then further inform what options and recommendations go up to the ministry in its report. And then after that report is submitted, it triggers the next piece of the process where the ministry considers those recommendations and identifies what the key kind of criteria are for an e-waste stewardship scheme, and also develops and puts in place any regulations that are needed to enable that product stewardship scheme to be established and get those approved by Cabinet. And then the process that it will run to find someone to be the accredited scheme manager, and that's where, likely in a tender process, the ministry will release information around, what the scheme will need to cover, which activities, and then, in those regulations will also be the way that the fees are going to be calculated, so that those are all publicly available and transparent. And that process is likely to take a year and a half sort of thing. So the current thinking is, 2023 is when we will have an accredited scheme manager in place, and the scheme commences operation. And then, you would have seen in that suggested governance structure slide, facility for further consultation and ongoing advice to the scheme manager, the accredited scheme, around ways that it could be modified, ways that it could be expanded, ways that it could be further enhanced over time. And then just to reiterate what will happen immediately after today, just to set you up for providing some feedback. We're going to have some Q&A now, and we'll be more than happy to take any questions and any points of clarification that you might have, but appreciate that this is a lot of information to take in, and we want to give you time and the opportunity to consider it and then provide your feedback over the next couple of weeks sort of thing. So what you're going to receive today is an information pack that essentially contains these slides plus some additional commentary. You'll receive that table Isaac referenced that has roles and responsibilities broken down by each of the key stakeholder groups. You'll also receive a set of the blank questions that will be in the feedback form, and the email will have a link to the online feedback form. So we want you to be able to take a look at this information in your own time and have a look at what the questions will be on the online form. Have a think about it, have a discussion about it with your team before jumping online to provide that feedback.